Good evening, bienvenue, and welcome to the Ottawa Centre All Candidates meeting. I would like to offer you a warm welcome to the Glebe Community Centre this evening in my role as the Glebe Community Association President. On behalf of the organizing committee, I would like to thank all the candidates for joining us this evening, those who are at the podium this evening, but also those who are joining us with tables around the exterior of the room. The debate is sponsored by a coalition of 10 community associations. These organizations are nonpartisan and work together to ensure that community members have an opportunity to be well informed about matters in their riding and are united in our pursuit of improving community life and the neighborhoods in which we live, play, work, and go to school. I would very much like to thank Rogers TV for live streaming this event this evening to make it accessible to those that cannot be in the room. And as you can see, we are in a packed house. I would also like to thank Adrien Harewood from CBC Television, who's agreed kindly to join us this evening as moderator of the event. The community associations that have joined together this evening are all from the eastern part of Ottawa Centre, and I'd like to acknowledge the considerable volunteer effort that went in over a period of many months to pull this event together. They include the Carlington Community Association, the Centretown Community Association, the Civic Hospital Neighbourhood Association, Dalhousie Community Association, Dow's Lake Residents Association, Glebe Annex Community Association, the Glebe Community Association, Hintonburg Community Association, Ottawa East Community Association, and Old Ottawa South Community Association. I thank them very much for the effort, and on behalf of all of them, I say welcome and thank you to the candidates for joining us. I turn it over to you, Adrien.
Well, welcome, welcome, welcome. What a crowd. Quite remarkable. Give yourselves a hand for being here. Amazing. I mean, isn't there a hockey game on or something? My name is Adrien Harewood from CBC Ottawa News at 6, and it is an honor for me to be serving as your moderator for this evening. Now, I just wanted to outline how things are going to work and also to tell you a little bit about how these candidates came to be on the stage. The decision was taken to limit the number of candidates participating in this debate. There were two criteria for inviting a party's candidate to join this debate. The first criteria, the party received more than 2.5% of the votes in Ottawa Centre in the last election. The second criteria, the Leaders Debate Commission, a federal body which organizes the national televised leaders debates, invited parties' leaders to join those national debates. The parties represented here tonight are those which will be participating in the national debates. So we have with us, and I'm going to introduce our candidates for this evening, the incumbent Catherine McKenna of the Liberals. Carol Clemenhagen of the Conservatives. Angela Keller-Herzog of the Green Party. Emily Tamman of the NDP. Marilee Sevilla of the People's Party of Canada. I would also like to acknowledge the other candidates in the riding, and some of them are here this evening, and if they can just please stand and be acknowledged. Chris Jones, an independent. Jiang Hatuvo, an independent. Shelley Bertrand from the Animal Protection Party of Canada. Marie-Chantal Leriche from the Christian Heritage Party of Canada. Stuart Ryan from the Communist Party of Canada. Karine Corcoran of the Libertarian Party of Canada. Adam Rolston from the National Citizens Alliance. So thank you to all of the candidates for being present this evening. Now, the candidates participating in this debate will make brief opening statements. Each candidate will have 1 minute to speak. Then the candidates will have the opportunity to debate issues amongst themselves for 3 minutes. Now, to get into the debate, I will begin by asking a series of questions, and eventually we will incorporate the questions that you, the audience, have given to our runners, and those questions as well will be posed to our candidates. Let's just talk about how an audience member can pose a question. We ask audience members to submit written questions. There were cards on the seats when you entered. As well, there are runners around the room. Can the runners just please identify themselves? So they have more cards, and they also have pens. And if you wish to pose a question, please write it on the card. If you catch the eye of the runner, they will bring you a card or a pen, and the runners will also collect questions and bring them to me, the moderator. As well, we would just ask that you please write the topic of your question at the top of the card in 1 or 2 words. Is that clear? Okay. Now, please hold your applause during the debate. We want to hear from the candidates as much as possible, and a lot of applause will mean fewer questions. You may have noticed also donation buckets on your way in. There are, of course, expenses associated with this event, and the organizers rely on donations to cover those expenses. So on your way out, you might want to consider making a donation. And I also just want to point out the safety exits in the event of an emergency. The safety exits in the corners of the room provide the best means of exiting the building. Okay, so we are now going to proceed. And I'd like to ask Marilee Sevilla of the People's Party of Canada to get things started with her opening statement.
All right, well, sorry. Thank you, Adrien, and I'd also like to thank the Ottawa Centre's Community Associations for inviting me and having me here. So my name is Marilee Sevilla. I'm running for the People's Party of Canada as a candidate for Ottawa Centre. I'm a public servant, a public speaker for mental health and well-being, as well as an LGBTQ advocate and ally. And I'm running on the principles of freedom, fairness, responsibility, and respect, something that our current government unfortunately hasn't given us the courtesy of. I'm here today running as a homeowner, a fellow taxpayer, as someone who's had enough of the irresponsible spending, the bailouts, the lack of accountability of our present Liberal government. I'm here as someone who's spoken with residents in Ottawa Centre who have told me they're not very satisfied with the current government. I've spoken to residents who live around the Dundonald Park, the homeless people on the Glebe and in Somerset, and they've told me that they have lost faith in our government system. No one should lose faith in our government system because we are supposed to be helping them. Every 4 years, we make a promise to help the Canadians that need it the most, and yet I've spoken to over a dozen of them, and they have lost faith and are not going to be voting, and I hope that will change. Let's put an end to corporate welfare. No more bailing out multi-million, billion-dollar companies. Let's put an end to the fact that we're helping large corporations like Loblaws buy fridges, when instead what we should be doing is helping Canadians and their families put food on their plates, put healthy, nutritious foods in the fridges that some of them can't afford. Let's help the families that need it the most.
Okay. You have to wrap it up.
I'd also like to say I'm here because as a country, we're only as strong and united as the people in it. So if we can't help the very people that need clean drinking water, a shelter, security, what good are we? We're putting our people second to the foreign aid dollars that we sent out.
Marilee Sevilla, thank you very much. Carol Clemenhagen of the Conservatives.
Thank you very much. Good evening. I'm Carol Clemenhagen, your Conservative Party candidate. I share voters' concerns about today's cost of living and affordability worries for the future. I'm also disappointed in the incumbent Liberal MP's absence on local issues. We need a minister for Ottawa who stands up for Ottawa Centre. I am alarmed by the Liberal government's lack of fiscal responsibility, certain to negatively impact debt burdens for future generations, and our ability to fund complex public priorities like healthcare and climate action, or to cope with the shocks of an economic downturn. Can voters trust Justin Trudeau and Catherine McKenna? Based on the past 4 years, the answer is clearly no. After a solemn election promise in 2015 to balance the budget, and despite a favorable economy, they delivered 4 successive years of deficits, this year's finale topping $20 billion. The federal debt is now more than $700 billion and growing. On climate action, the incumbent Liberal MP has failed in her prime responsibility, which was to work constructively with the provinces and territories. Auditors General, federal and provincial, looked at the Liberal plan and actions to date. We're 20% above 2020 targets. The auditors did not find evidence to suggest that the Liberal plans could get us to meeting 2030 targets. Now this week, another Liberal PR statement, we're going to be net zero by 2050. Climate change is an urgent, critical concern. We need to be serious about lowering greenhouse gas emissions quickly and driving business to the highest standards of green technology. The choice voters will make will come down to which party they trust to strengthen the economy, to competently manage public funds instead of blowing taxpayers' dollars on debt interest charges, hampering our future, impeding our ability to invest in healthcare and climate action. I'm asking for your vote for a competent and caring Conservative government.
Okay, thank you, Carol Clemenhagen. Our next speaker is Emily Tamman from the NDP.
Thank you, Adrien. I'd like to start by acknowledging that we're gathered on the unceded and unsurrendered territory of the Algonquin Anishinaabe people. I'd like to also congratulate all of you for this excellent turnout. This is a community that really cares about democracy. Merci beaucoup pour votre engagement dans cette élection. Like many of you, though, I am concerned about our democracy. I'm concerned that even as we're demanding urgent action on the climate crisis, we're now the collective owners of a pipeline, and we're continuing to subsidize fossil fuel. I'm concerned that instead of fearlessly standing up for human rights, our government continues to fight Indigenous kids in court and to sell arms to Saudi Arabia. And like many of you in this room, I know I feel betrayed by the broken promise on electoral reform. When you raise people's expectations and you let them down, you extinguish the hope that democracy can and should work for people. You fuel cynicism and encourage the rise of right-wing populists who offer no solutions. Things don't have to be this way, but we need the courage to challenge the status quo. If our ideas don't offend fossil fuel executives, billionaires, and corporate developers, then we're not acting with the urgency this moment requires. Je me présente parce qu'il faut remettre les principes en nos politiques. Nous devons cesser de subventionner les grandes entreprises polluantes et investir plutôt dans les énergies renouvelables et le transport en commun. We need to do more than just assert that housing is a right, but give effect to that right by building affordable housing and cracking down on speculation. We need to take on big pharma and fulfill Tommy Douglas's vision of universal pharmacare and dental care for all. We need a tax policy that compels the largest corporations to pay their fair share rather than letting them siphon their profits offshore. We need action, not words and broken promises. So let's build on the legacies of Ed Broadbent and Paul Dewar in our riding and work together for climate, economic, and social justice. Okay. Thank you very much. Let's have a great debate.
Thank you, Emily Tamman. Please hold the applause. Our next speaker is the incumbent Catherine McKenna, the Liberals.
Thank you very much, Adrien, and I'm thrilled to be here. I can't believe how many people had to wait outside. It's great. We're owning our democracy. We had the largest voter turnout last election. I hope it continues. I also want to recognize we're on the traditional territory of the Algonquin, and Anishinaabe peoples. Et je veux féliciter à tout le monde, tous les Franco-Ontariens. Aujourd'hui, c'est la journée des Franco-Ontariens et Ontariennes. Look, you guys took a chance on me. Many of you last election. I committed to work really hard for you. I committed to listen. I committed to deliver on local platform. I hope you feel that I earned that. We knocked on a lot of doors. Many of you supported me, and we've done a lot of amazing things together. I imagine some of you took the Flora footbridge here, which I think is a pretty great development. Also LRT. The investments we're making in affordable housing right here, helping 1,600 people, and there's a lot more work to do. The super library, which is going to be great, and so many other things. This is a really important election. I ran last time because I was really concerned the direction the country was going in. We've done a lot of work. We've created 1 million jobs with Canadians. We've raised 300,000 children out of poverty. That's 10,000 families right here, 12,000 kids that have been helped. And we have the most ambitious climate plan of any federal government. I know some of you may not agree with all the points of that climate plan, but we are taking serious action, ambitious action, practical action in the face of conservative politicians that want to go back in time. We cannot afford to go back in time. We need to continue the hard work, and we need to continue building our amazing community. I'm going to continue on the priorities and building a local platform. The things I believe in for sure are the greenest, making Ottawa the greenest capital ever, making sure that we continue to create good jobs here, we support our public servants, and also fighting intolerance and division. I'm extremely concerned by what I'm seeing that has come from the United States and other places that has come to our country.
Okay. Thank you, Catherine McKenna. Our final opening statement is Angela Keller-Herzog of the Green Party.
Bonjour, mon nom est Angela Keller-Herzog et je suis candidate pour le Parti vert, ici sur le territoire non cédé des Algonquins. In this election, you as a voter have a very big choice. Not just a choice between political parties, but a choice between futures, for us, for our children, and for our planet. The destabilizing climate calls for far more political courage and leadership than the old parties have shown. Greta Thunberg has called out world leaders, and she is right. In Canada, both Liberals and Conservatives are simply incapable of getting the economy off fossil fuels and steering a course for a renewable energy, new economy with good jobs. It's time to step up, and that's what I'm doing. I will put 3 themes at the heart of my work for you in Parliament: healthy people, a healthy economy, and a healthy planet. I've lived in Ottawa Centre for over 30 years. And since April, I've knocked on thousands of doors in Ottawa Centre. I have listened, and I will continue to listen to you to represent your concerns. I've worked in international development for 20 years, and I have represented Canada overseas. I'm an economist and small business owner. I have contributed to this community through my work with my community association, with Ecology Ottawa, as a co-founder of Ottawa Centre Refugee Action, and as a board member of Ottawa Renewable Energy Co-op. I know many of you, and I hope to get to know many more of you. Thank you, merci, votez vert, vote green.
Okay. Thank you, Angela Keller-Herzog. Before we get to the first question, I understand that people in the back seem to be having trouble hearing. Is that correct? Hearing Catherine McKenna? Okay, so I'm just going to ask the technician maybe if we could boost things a little bit, because apparently people couldn't hear all of your statement. But I'm going to ask the first question, pose the first question to Carol Clemenhagen, because Carol, we know that in our region there's some people who have suffered through 3 extreme climate events in the last couple of years. 2 floods and a tornado. And we know that extreme weather events are becoming more common around the world. We see the rapid decline of glaciers in places like Greenland and Switzerland, hurricanes in the Caribbean. We also know that the world's leading climate scientists have warned that we have 11 years for global warming to be kept to a maximum of 1.5 degrees Celsius, beyond which even a half degree will worsen the risk of droughts, floods, and extreme heat. Can you explain your Conservative Party's plan to tackle climate change and why you think it is sufficient to meet this moment that we face, which many climate scientists say is a climate emergency?
Yes, I'll certainly try to do that. The Paris targets are conservative targets. They were put in place by the previous Conservative government. And so the plan that is put forward now by our party is to move forward to give Canada the best chance of achieving those targets. So establishing emission standards, mandatory emission standards, in the event that, and reducing the threshold so that we actually capture more large emitters, as opposed to the Liberals who gave large emitters a pass on their commitments. Investing in technology, using technology to push the innovation forward to allow us to reduce emissions faster, more effectively, and moving forward as quickly as possible in collaboration with the provinces. Unfortunately, the Liberal incumbent has irritated, annoyed, made derogatory comments about premiers, slowing our process, getting us off track. We should be focused on reducing greenhouse gas emissions. That's our priority. That's what the Conservative plan wants to do.
Catherine McKenna, can we afford to be building a pipeline in a climate emergency?
Well, thanks very much. I think it's really important that people understand what our plan is, and it's really Canada's plan, because we negotiated for 1 year with provinces and territories, so to the extent people want to look it up, it's called Clean Canada. It is over 50 measures. Measures that range from phasing out coal
Rachel
to
Notley
making
famously said the Liberal plan isn't worth the paper it's walked on.
Carol, please let her finish.
See, part of the problem is Conservative politicians don't seem to listen to the science, nor do they want to have discussions on what we need to do to take climate action. We have worked so hard. We had every single province but one, Saskatchewan, on board with a climate plan. Did we need to do more? Absolutely. But putting a price on pollution, now we're having to fight putting a price on pollution. The Conservative politicians would rather spend your taxpayer dollars in court than actually fight climate change. That we have made historic investments. We were the only party last election who said that we were going to make the investments in infrastructure. That means that we can do LRT, that is the biggest reduction in greenhouse gas emissions in our country's history. That we've made investments in clean technologies. And yes, we did not approve Northern Gateway. We did approve the Trans Mountain expansion, twinning of an existing pipeline. It fit within our climate plan. And you may say, why? Because Rachel Notley was very brave. She did something very, very brave. An NDP politician. She put a hard cap on emissions in the oil sands. She phased out coal. She put a price on pollution. That enabled us to have a national climate plan.
But the question was, and I'm going to pose it again, can you afford to be building a pipeline when the world's leading climate scientists say that we are in a climate emergency?
So it is really important to understand this pipeline is not increasing emissions. It's getting the resources to market, and with the money we get with that, every single dollar is going to a clean economy. We have invested $60 billion. But the one thing I have learned in the last 4 years, I'm the second longest serving environment minister, is that you have to have people at the heart of your climate policy. If you don't worry about the transition, if you don't worry about jobs, if you don't worry about how people are going to fit in it, then you won't be able to move forward on climate policy. And that is why we are working so hard. We're committed to meeting our targets. We have already 3/4 of the way there. We're still 11 years out. We've mapped out how we're going to get there. And now we're saying we're going to net zero. Because we can do this. We have to have ambitious targets. It would be much better, though, if we could work with provinces and territories. To Carol's point, I wish to God I could work with Conservative politicians rather than fight them in court. But they have said that everything we have done, and this is at risk, and I think this is what is at stake, folks, in this election.
Okay.
We could go back in time where it's free to pollute, where we don't have better rules for major projects.
Okay, we're going to have to end it there. Thank you. Marilee Sevilla, do you believe, does your party even believe in human-induced climate change?
Sorry, could you...
Does your party believe in human-induced climate change?
People are wondering, do we believe in climate change? Climate change is changing.
No, I said human-induced climate
Human-induced?
change.
Well, yes, we're polluting. We're not looking at sustainable ways of preventing it. We're constantly driving our cars. We're not helping the infrastructure. So of course, human-induced pollution does exist, and so yes.
And do you believe the world's leading climate scientists who say that we're in a climate emergency?
No, I don't.
And okay. And what's no, it's a fair point. And can you provide what's your evidence?
Because with scientists that say there's a climate crisis, there are scientists that also say, no, there isn't. What we're going through is perfectly normal.
Okay, please let her finish. Please let her finish.
So, I ask anyone out there, think about when you were in school, what did you learn? Did you learn about climate change, global warming? Yes. And then you learned that the world goes through these cycles. Just like the Amazon has fires to help
Please
the
let her
soil.
finish. Please respect all of our candidates and allow them to finish. Please go. Go ahead, Marilee.
There are two sides to a story. Okay?
What's your evidence, though?
There are scientists that also counter other scientists that say there isn't a climate crisis. We can address this. So you have to look at both sides. We can't just suddenly listen to Greta and say, there is a climate crisis, yes, we allow you to skip school and have a march. What about in 2018 when we had an Indigenous girl go to the UN and say, we have a drinking water crisis. There's no drinking water in northern countries. Why aren't we listening to that? But we are listening to Greta, who skipped school to say, I'm protesting crisis, but not this teenager from Ontario.
Okay. Emily Taman, what distinguishes the NDP's climate plan from the Green Party's plan, and why is it a better plan?
You know, I think our plans have a lot in common. I think New Democrats and Greens are the only people that are taking climate change seriously, who are willing to make the tough decisions to end fossil fuel subsidies, not to expand our fossil fuel infrastructure at a time that we need to be transitioning off fossil fuels. And I admire what the Green Party's putting forward. I think we have, a lot of similarities in terms of our approach. And I'm really, really disheartened, honestly, to hear comments like we just heard from the People's Party candidate, to hear Ms. Clemenhagen talking about a completely unrealistic proposal. We are in a climate emergency. One of the biggest acts of hypocrisy I've seen out of our current government was declaring a climate emergency one day and approving a pipeline the next day. That is unacceptable. And I didn't hear a very good explanation. New Democrats were the first to talk about a just transition. There is no question this is going to be a difficult and disruptive time. We need to put working people and Indigenous people at the front of the solutions that we're bringing forward. But to suggest that we can build a pipeline expansion and come close to meeting our target goals, and I have to say that yesterday's announcement was another exercise in hypocrisy, that we're going to have the most ambitious targets when we can't even meet, right now today, the weak targets that were established by Stephen Harper is completely unacceptable. We can do better. We have to have the courage to do the work. We're going to invest in public transit on a massive scale. We're going to work towards free public transit. These are the kinds of decisions we have to do.
And yet, Emily Taman, is it not the case that there's a lot of incoherence amongst NDP leaders in this country? Is it not the case that there are prominent NDP leaders who want to build a pipeline?
Well, I mean, which ones? Rachel Notley?
Well, Rachel Notley did she not?
She did, absolutely. I'm running for the federal NDP. Rachel Notley had a very particular job to do. I have an enormous amount of respect for the work she did as Premier of Alberta. But, let's get real here. We're talking about a federal election. When I hear Liberals talk about the national economic interest, I'm interested in the national interest. And a credible climate plan has to be part of how we talk about the public interest.
So how would an NDP government deal with hostile provincial governments?
Well, I mean, I'm not going to lie, that's a really big challenge. We can only cross our fingers and hope that some of the worst won't be around for much longer. But, there's no question that federal-provincial relations are a challenge for all governments. The decision on whether to approve the Trans Mountain Pipeline lay with the federal government. That was the federal government's decision. It was in the federal government's decision, and in my view, they made the wrong call there.
Angela Keller-Herzog, I'm going to pose a question to you as well. How do you plan to manage the federal-provincial relationship with hostile governments in achieving a carbon-neutral economy by 2030? How would a Green Party do it? Green Party government do it?
Well, I think that it's clear that the federal government has a responsibility to lead the whole country and not be beholden to particular corporate interests or particular sectoral interests. That's the idea of federal government acting in the long-term public interest.
And how far would a Green government be willing to go in order to implement that plan?
I think that we're facing the biggest challenge that we have ever faced before of the threat of a completely destabilizing climate. Elizabeth May has likened this to the challenges that we were facing in the wartime, and she has made the call that we need to have all hands on deck. We need to have political parties working together and get over this broken politics that we seem to have.
Emily Taman says that there's really little difference between the NDP climate plan and the Green Party plan. Is that the case?
I would certainly support a lot of what Emily has just said. I think that there are also some differences, of course. I think that the Green Party is the most serious and the most resolute of all the parties in addressing climate change. We have a plan, a target, and a roadmap. Our target is in line with the Paris and the science, because we need to take urgent action. By 2030, the Green Plan is looking at a greenhouse gas emissions reduction of 60%. The NDP, 38%. The Liberals 30, and I should add the Liberals are not on track to meet those targets. Emissions have been increasing under the Liberal government, and the Conservatives don't really have a plan.
Cara Clement-Higgin, do you want to respond to that?
Yeah, yes, I certainly would. I think it's interesting to hear the Liberal MP talk about it's all the Conservatives' fault. They had a majority government, a Liberal government in Ontario, a Liberal government in Quebec, an NDP government in Alberta, and still we are 20% over our 2020 targets and not on track to meet 2030. So talking about blaming provincial premiers of whatever stripe, or Conservative premiers in particular, doesn't make sense. The nature of the country, we're a federation. It's built upon federal-provincial cooperation. We need the provinces involved because there's a lot of heavy lifting in trying to move the transition forward quicker, transition to a low-carbon economy. At the moment, the energy sector contributes about 11% of our GDP. We are, I had to look this up, we're the 6th largest energy producer in the world, the 5th largest net exporter, and the 8th largest energy consumer in the world. The transition, there's not a magic switch, unfortunately, where we could say, like the NDP does, we're going to change everything overnight. The transition is going to be terribly intense and difficult. We need the cooperation between a federal government that has leadership, that is able to work with the provinces in a constructive, collaborative way. The provinces are not always that easy for a federal government to deal with. We've all seen that on issues over time. So it's particularly important that the Minister of Environment and Climate Change figures out how to work with the provincial counterparts in order to move forward. There is a crisis. We do need to reduce greenhouse gas emissions quickly, or quicker than we certainly have been under any plan that is on the books at the moment. That's what the Conservative plan is about. We want to move forward in collaboration with the provinces and territories to get the job done.
Okay. Catherine McKenny wanted to say something quickly.
Yeah, I mean, I think one thing that I would say about provinces and territories, and I think this is very important because I think it applies to all parties, that it is up to the federal government to act in the national interest, and that is exactly what we have done. We worked with all the provinces as territories to the extent we could, and then we got Conservative governments that backtracked on all the commitments. So when Doug Ford, the first thing he did when made it free to pollute, that increased the amount of emissions in Ontario by the equivalent of 30 coal-fired units. So we said no. Putting a price on pollution, that is in the national interest because pollution knows no borders. That is what we have done. We have seen the leader of the NDP saying that he would not act in the national interest, that if there were major infrastructure projects, well, what if you needed clean power transmission lines between provinces? You have to act in the national interest. The federal government sometimes will not be able to get agreement with provinces and territories, and we need to have a federal government that exercises its constitutional right and makes big decisions, because otherwise, how are we going to act like a country? How are we going to tackle this climate crisis? I'm absolutely sympathetic to those that think we need to do more, but the most important thing we need to do is land everything that we have done now, and then we have to continue the hard work that we are doing, and if we can't do it with provinces because they are stepping back under conservative politicians, then we have to do exactly with what we did in the United States.
Okay.
We work with businesses, we work with cities, and we work with people.
Emily Tam.
Well, you know, I understand why there's been a real effort in this election to frame the question as being between Liberals and Conservatives, and this idea that we're going to move backwards if we don't elect Liberals. Well, we can elect New Democrats, and we can make a real difference. I've been very, very frustrated to see so much of the discussion in the course of this election turn on whether or not we should have a carbon tax. We support a price on pollution, but it's not nearly enough. It's not going to get us where we need to go. And so it's been frustrating to see so much of the debate and to see Conservatives in particular trying to turn this into a referendum on a carbon tax as if that's going to get us anywhere close to where we need to be. So, you know, I think the reality is Liberals and Conservatives have had many opportunities over the last 30 years to address this crisis. This is not new information in the last 4 years. We've known that we need to act on climate change, and neither Liberals or Conservatives have been willing to do the work to get it done, and so that's why we're in the position today. We could have had nice, incremental, gentle solutions spread out over the course of 30 years, but the reality is the position that we're in today, we don't have the luxury of time. So we have to be willing to do the hard work and transition our economy, unfortunately, a lot faster than many of us would like.
Okay.
But we don't have a choice.
Okay. Angela Keller-Herzog, final word to you. Final word to you, if you'd like.
Okay. I think that this is a cliche, but we don't need more talk, we need action. And I'm sorry, Catherine, you say that you have a big book of 50 things. But in terms of the carbon tax not being the only tool, first of all, if it is one tool, then let's start it at a level that's effective. Let's have a carbon tax that's rising over time so that as people make replacement decisions, they go with electric motors and electric heating. Why don't we have a fuel standard? That's been a talk shop for years. Why is it that the methane emissions agreement with the United States was put on ice for 3 years with the Liberals? Why don't we have an EV mandate? Why don't we have EV charging stations? Why is it that the promise to cut fossil fuel subsidies, which are fueling the fire that is burning down our house, why are they actually being increased and topped up? I'm sorry, but we need effective action, and there's a reason why Canadian emissions are rising. It's because you're failing to address the fossil fuel sector.
Okay, we're gonna move on to another question. Recently, the Canadian Human Rights Tribunal ordered the federal government to pay compensation of $2 billion to First Nations children for the government's long-standing failure to provide adequate child welfare services in First Nations communities. Now, the tribunal ruled that Ottawa has, quote, willfully and recklessly discriminated against First Nations children. Now, Canada has known about the inequalities in federally funded public services for at least 112 years. When Dr. Peter Bryce, the Chief Medical Officer for the Indian Affairs Department, linked deep health funding inequalities for First Nations with the preventative deaths of children in residential schools. In all this time, report after report has issued solutions, but the Government of Canada has not adopted a comprehensive plan to eliminate all of the inequalities across all federally funded services for First Nations. Catherine McKenna, why not?
So we've done a lot as a government. My background, I started a human rights organization working with Indigenous youth with a program called Dare to Dream. We need all young people to succeed, especially Indigenous young people. And we have made changes, we have made investments. One of the most important things was the Child Welfare Act that we were able to pass, also the Indigenous Language Act. If you listen to Perry Bellegarde, the billions that we have invested in Indigenous communities. Personally, I've worked extremely closely with Inuit, First Nation, Métis peoples to protect more of nature through Indigenous protected areas, through Indigenous Guardians programs where you have youth working with elders on the land. We've moved forward with many settlements, with land claim agreements. Is there more work to do? Absolutely. Reconciliation is extraordinarily hard, and each community is different. You can't even really use the word Indigenous because First Nations, Métis, and Inuit are absolutely different peoples. And we have more work to do, and I think that you've seen we have made a lot of progress, but we have to continue.
But Catherine McKenna, you know that if someone who you know very well, Cindy Blackstock, were here, Cindy Blackstock, of course, in the First Nations Child and Family Caring Society of Canada, she would say that's not good enough, and that you know better, and that the Canadian state has known better for a very, very long time and has not lived up to its responsibilities. Why not change the situation now?
I think we have done so many things to improve the situation. I'm part of the Reconciliation Cabinet Committee. We've worked hard in so many areas. The need is so great, the challenges are great, and it's not going to happen overnight. I wish there was some magic wand that you could wave. You can't. And each community is very different, and the relationships are very different, and the rebuilding of trust is extreme. We have spent billions of dollars trying to make reparations for the past, to make investments in clean drinking water, to make investments to fight tuberculosis, which the rates are the same as East Timor, where I worked when I was a UN worker. But we have a lot more work to do. And that is going to have to continue, whether it's the investments, for sure, in young people, investments in communities, but also we all have to work on reconciliation. Reconciliation is really hard, and I think many of us in school, we didn't even learn about the challenges with Indigenous peoples, the history of residential schools. We've made a number of apologies, but that certainly doesn't go far enough. But we absolutely need to continue on this track, and I agree with Cindy Blackstock in much of what she says. I've worked with her.
Emily Taman, Catherine McKenna is basically saying that the Liberal government did the best that it could.
That's not good enough. I mean, first of all, the question wasn't about reconciliation. The question was about fighting Indigenous kids in court. It was about the Human Rights Tribunal that has had to make multiple non-compliance orders. An organization, Cindy Blackstock's organization, that was harassed by the Stephen Harper government for years, 10 years of litigation, to finally get a ruling from the Human Rights Tribunal that Canada is discriminating against First Nations, Indigenous, and Métis kids by underfunding education, by underfunding healthcare, and the child welfare system is a national disgrace. It makes me embarrassed to be a Canadian, and as a mother, I find it extremely painful to read about the rate of First Nations kids that are being taken from their homes at a rate higher than we saw under the 60s scoop and in residential school, and to read just today about the rates of death of those kids when they're in care. It is completely unacceptable, and Cindy Blackstock will tell you that on a lot of these things, like Jordan's Principle and Shannon's Dream, it is a question of money, plain and simple.
So what would an NDP government do differently?
Well, first of all, we would start by respecting the decision of the tribunal and give it effect by ensuring that the level of funding for Indigenous kids is equal to that of the rest of kids in Canada. I mean, it's as simple as that. And I asked Cindy, I said, well, this is obviously a very complex issue, like, help me to understand, She said, no. It's a question of funding. On this particular point, the question of reconciliation, I agree. It's not going to happen overnight. We have to rebuild trust with communities. There's no question. But on the specific question of the human rights violation, which is a part of the genocide against Indigenous people in our country, it's not good enough. I'm sorry.
Carol Clement-Hagan, how would the Conservative Party deal with this problem that many people have just described as an intractable problem?
Certainly the ruling has informed the future. Anything that happens now will, in fact, be as a function of the ruling that's in place. I think that the focus on health inequalities, education, those are very practical areas where more needs to be done to find a way to work in the best way possible, in a reconciled way possible with First Nations people to allow progress to unfold. That, in a way, is what we're talking about.
So what would reconciliation look like if a Conservative government were in power?
I think reconciliation is obviously an indication of respect. So the respect between people, the ability to work together, the ability to acknowledge difficulties, terrible things that have happened in the past, but to move forward to look to the future.
Marilee Sevilla, what would be the approach of the People's Party of Canada to addressing this matter of reconciliation with Canada's Indigenous peoples?
Well, the first thing is to, of course, honor what the tribunal said, but also give them the funding they need. If they are in the north and they are lacking water, shelter, healthcare, education, we should be taking our money that we send off overseas to help Afghanistan build infrastructure, roads in Saudi Arabia, and all these arms, and put it back into our country and help these people. The NDPs, the Liberals, the Conservatives, if First Nation is so important, so part of the Canadian history, why are we not addressing them? Why are we not providing the resources that they need? There are families, like you guys talk about the scoop. I was in school and I learned about that in school. I learned about that and I thought, that can't be, but that is our history, and it was a dark part of our history.
It's our present.
Sorry?
It's also our present.
It is. So we as a government have to be the voice for these communities that they have the stereotype. We need to break that stereotype and say, no, they aren't just living off the land. They're not just drunks. They're not just alcoholics. No, we have to step in as a government, take our funding that we have, our tax dollars that we spend elsewhere, and give it to them and help them. Help educate other Canadians to realize First Nations Aboriginals deserve the same respect as every other Canadian here.
Angela Keller-Herzog?
I would first of all like to say that I agree with every single thing that Emily said on the subject. And I would like to take it further and say a couple of things that Emily would agree with. The Green Party, in terms of your question of what does reconciliation look like, we would support the implementation of the UN Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, which was a bill put forward also by Romeo Saganash, an NDP member of Parliament in the just finished Parliament, that was then voted down by the ruling parties. We would implement the calls to action in the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. We would implement the inquiry into missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls. And we would commit to the dismantling of the Indian Act in partnership with First Nations, respecting Indigenous sovereignty and self-determination. We would also create a new body, a Council of Canadian Governments, and include Indigenous nations and peoples as equal partners. I think the example of the drinking water, of the lack of education, and the lack of health access that we've seen, those are examples of systemic oppression, and it is a continuation of the colonial relations that have caused the problem needing reconciliation. So as, again, Emily pointed out, we are still living in these colonial mindsets and structures, and we need to make change.
Catherine McKenna, if the Liberals get another mandate, will your party commit to dismantling the Indian Act?
So that's a really complicated issue. And I think that it's easy to say for some people that you would do that. I talk to a lot of different communities. Within First Nation communities, there's not even agreement on that. What we need to do is move forward in a better way, and we work with.
What does that mean? What does it mean, move forward in a better way?
It means every day working really hard in reconciliation, whether it's in protecting nature and doing it in partnership with Indigenous peoples. We are leading the world in how we are doing Indigenous protected areas. We just announced protecting 8% of our Arctic with Inuit. in a groundbreaking way of looking at how Inuit want to protect their own areas, their own lands. We did better rules for major projects. It was severely opposed by the Conservatives. They said they would revoke the rules, and we have said that Indigenous traditional knowledge is a must-have, not a nice-to-have, that from the start you need to consult and accommodate and work with Indigenous peoples. They need to be involved from the start. It is across government. I've seen that there is no easy answer on this, and also assuming that certain communities believe certain things. Inuit have very different views than many First Nations. But Perry Bellegarde has said it best. We have done a ton of work under our government after the legacy of the Harper government. We still have a lot more work to do, and we will continue doing that and working hard every single day through every single file where the thread is yes, investment, but also respect. And I agree with Angela and I agree with Emily. Respect is at heart of it. The investment, the chronic underfunding must be rectified, and we have certainly worked extremely hard at that. But there's a lot more work to do, and it may take us, to undo 100 years or more of colonialization. It may take us a very long time, but we need to continue the hard work, and that is exactly what we've done. We did the inquiry into missing and murdered Indigenous women. We said that we would respect all the recommendations of the Commission, that we are implementing UNDRIP. And we did vote, I will say, at the committee level, we certainly, in the House of Commons, we supported UNDRIP. It was the Conservative government that opposed it.
Okay. Emily Tamman, do you want to add anything, or any of our candidates?
The only thing I'll add is that I think one area where no progress at all has been made on the reconciliation front is in our criminal justice system. As a former prosecutor, as someone who's worked in the justice system, I was really, really disappointed to see the lack of any meaningful criminal justice reform that would get at the over-incarceration of Indigenous people, systemic racism in our justice system, and speaking for myself, this would be a top-of-mind priority because our justice system is also systemically oppressing Indigenous people and adding layers upon layers to trauma.
Okay.
I actually agree with that.
Does anyone have anything to add? If not, I'll move on.
Just one final thing. I think we're talking about the importance of reconciliation, which goes without saying. We also need to, I think, remember that there are First Nations groups that are very interested in investing in, being involved in pipeline issues. Being part of economic development is one of the key areas, the key ways of looking towards the future. So I think we need to acknowledge that a great number of First Nations groups in Alberta, et cetera, want to be involved in the energy sector and have a right to be there as well.
Okay. I think we're going to, unless you had something to say, we're going to move on to the next question. Very quickly, please.
Yes, I think that what's particularly galling is when promises are broken. I think we all dared to hope that there would be an improvement when the Liberals got in at last election on the promise of reconciliation. But what we saw repeatedly is while there was supposedly meaningful consultations going on and the solicitation of informed, free prior consent, at the same time there was Cabinet making pipeline decisions, making decisions about LNG gas that basically didn't wait for the consultations to finish.
Okay. Okay, we're going to move on. Marilee Savilla, Canada's population is aging. According to the Conference Board of Canada, 25% of Canada's population will be over 65 by 2035. 5 million Canadians are set to retire by 2035. Canada's fertility rate of 1.6%, which ranks 181st in the world, is well below its replacement rate of 2.1%. Why is the People's Party of Canada pledging to reduce the number of immigrants and refugees entering Canada every year?
Thank you for the question. The reason we're looking to reduce is for mass immigration. We want to bring in immigrants that will help our economy, that will contribute. Right now, of the people that come in, only 26% of them are working. And for those who saw the news yesterday morning, there were two different numbers, and that was talking about the families and the individuals that are coming to the country. Yes, we want to control the immigration because we don't want someone to come to our country and use our system. The business of birthing, people coming to Canada, giving birth to their kids, and all of a sudden they get citizenship, is that right? who's paying for that? Who's paying for that? That's a tax dollar.
Okay, enough, please. Marilee Sevilla, demographers, though, would argue that you're courting demographic disaster. You know, your party is proposing reducing the number of immigrants coming to the country from 321,000 to between 100 and 150,000. They say that will lead to economic disaster.
I think that I stick to what I said. We are controlling immigration. We're bringing in skilled workers. That's what we need. And immigration, we're helping. If we bring in people who aren't going to contribute, that doesn't help us. That doesn't help the fact that we're a shortage, we have an aging population. If they're not going to go to work, what happens? People are still working. People aren't getting the money they need. So we're trying to bring in people who will actually contribute. There are doctors. I had a doctor about a year ago. He was deported to the States because his adopted daughter, her papers didn't pass the Canadian immigration. 2 doctors, they had 150 patients. I lost my family doctor because our immigration government said, nope, your daughter that you adopted from South Africa her papers aren't kosher. And yet they're from the States. They passed the papers, they came here, opened the practice in South Bank Medical, and then they were deported in June. There are 150 people in Ottawa South right now who don't have a doctor because the immigration policy says, nope, 2 doctors, we don't need you.
Carol Clemenhagen, does the Conservative Party agree with that position? Does it agree that there's mass immigration in Canada and that it leads to social tension?
No. I'd like to talk about the aging issue because that is a very important issue. And in fact, it's related to my primary concern about the lack of Liberals' fiscal responsibility. With debt and deficits at the current level, my concern is that we're not going to have the ability, the room to make investments in healthcare, for example, which is complex as we speak, and even more complex into the future given the aging population. That does require a great deal of investment and thinking about how we are going to be organized in the health system to accommodate the aging population. On the question of immigration, the Conservative Party's position on immigration is that we in Canada have and need to have a compassionate, orderly, fair immigration system. There are labor shortages. We clearly need immigration to help with skilled labor shortages. So we're a welcoming country. The Conservative plan going forward is to obviously continue our welcome to the world, particularly refugees who are fleeing dangerous situations, life-threatening situations. Where we do need to rectify a situation is with illegal border crossings, of unregulated border crossings. That does create issues. We have here in Ottawa, there's been problems with housing for additional refugees, homeless issues associated with refugee placement in the city. We need to have a more orderly process, and we certainly can do that. The Liberals were uneasy about making changes. We should be able to organize ourselves better to deal with illegal border crossings.
Okay. Emily Chapman?
Well, I mean, first of all, there's no such thing as mass migration, and when you talk about that, the racial undertones there, and I think are really disturbing. I think, you know, we have a safe and orderly immigration system already. We have a world-class immigration system. We have a very, very small number of people who have come across the border, not at an authorized port of entry, in order to preserve their right to seek asylum in Canada. Because we have a safe third country agreement, we border a country that is engaging in the most inhumane treatment of migrants in the United States, caging children. And so if people want to seek asylum in Canada, up until recently, the only way that they could was to come not at an authorized border point in order to actually legally be able to seek asylum in Canada. You can't stop that. That is our international obligation, that if a person seeks asylum from within our border, then we have to adjudicate their claim. Now, what the Liberals did that I think is very harmful right near the end of this last Parliament was to amend the Immigration Act in an omnibus bill, something that they promised in the last election they would stop doing, yet did many times over the course of the past 4 years, which means that if someone comes across irregularly, despite the Safe Third Country Agreement, if they've sought asylum in another jurisdiction, they can no longer seek asylum here. And I think that's really unfortunate, because I think the obvious and correct solution there is to suspend the Safe Third Country Agreement until we can get rid of Donald Trump and get like a more sane immigration policy in the US.
Angela Keller-Herzog?
Yes, I would actually, on this topic, I would like to give some kudos to the Liberal government. I think that at the time of the last election, we had a promise to provide a safe haven and to help a large number of Syrian refugees from the Syrian refugee crisis. And the Liberals did that. I think that there was an extraordinary effort made, also by many people working in our federal civil service. And I think that there was an enormous welcome from many of you in this community for also private refugee sponsorship. And I think that that was something that was well done.
Catherine McKenna?
Well, first of all, I want to give a shout out to Angela, because I know she was part of a group of 5, and she supported a refugee family. And look, I'm not entirely sure whether we're talking about seniors or refugee or immigration, but maybe I can tackle all of them at once. So, I mean, certainly in terms of immigration, we had to reinvest in our immigration system. The massive cuts that were made under the Harper government meant that the people were waiting forever. We still saw people in my office. We still see people in the office who are coming in who've taken far too long because of underinvestment. We brought in 40,000 refugees, thanks to so many of you. We're a welcoming community. Certainly here in Ottawa Centre, we restored health care to refugees, which criminally was taken away under Conservatives, and we support increased immigration numbers. We need immigration. My dad is an immigrant. He came from Ireland 52 years ago, and he's contributed to this country, and immigrants do contribute to this country, and I think it's extremely important. I mean, in terms of seniors, I mean, my focus on seniors and our focus as a government is to be making sure that seniors can retire with dignity. That when you look at, we've made increases, well, we lowered the age from 67, you may remember that was raised under the Conservatives, of old age security and guaranteed income supplement back to 65. We increased guaranteed income supplement. That's raised almost 60,000 seniors out of poverty, in particular women who often are single and living in poverty, but many people I meet in boarding homes, boarding rooms right here in Ottawa Centre. So all of this is, what kind of society do we want? A society that accepts refugees, that accepts immigrants, that provides for the most vulnerable, that supports our seniors. And this is what we have worked extremely hard to do. And we now have 1 million more people who are out of poverty, almost 1 million more under our policies.
Marilee, quickly.
When it comes to the immigration policies of the People's Party of Canada, my parents were also immigrants, so I'm a first-generation Canadian. My mom came to this country. She worked hard. She supported her sisters to come here and her grandparents, and they worked hard. They gave me a great future. I went to university, and I've paid my way. The one thing that I talk about when it talks about immigration is when you come to this country, when you come to Canada, you are coming here on the premise that you are embracing the diversity and the multiculturalism of Canada. When you come to Canada, people come here. Do you know the number of times that I've had homophobic and racist slurs thrown at me from people who don't understand that in Canada, you are allowed to be with another woman. You are allowed to love who you want. But they come to this country and they say, nope, in my country, you would be stoned. In my country, these are our beliefs. I respect your beliefs, but the moment you say you're going to be violent towards me, that is when I have a problem, and that is where our immigration system needs to vet for these.
Okay.
So, I mean, I think everyone would agree.
We're going to move on. We're going to, well, thank you. Carol Clemenhagen, Canadians spent $34 billion on prescription medicines in 2018. After hospitals, drugs are the second biggest expenditure in healthcare. On a per capita basis, only the United States and Switzerland pay more for prescription drugs. Yet still, 1 in 5 Canadians struggle to pay for their medication. 3 million don't fill their prescriptions because they can't afford to. 1 million Canadians cut spending on food and heat to be able to afford their medication. Is it not time to finally bring universal pharmacare to Canadians?
The health system as a whole is under considerable pressure. If you want to try to find a family medicine in Ottawa Centre, it's a struggle. If you want to have a place for a frail elderly loved one to be placed into long-term care, there's a very long waiting list. The health system is under constraint. My concern when we talk about a universal pharmacare program is that we are setting ourselves up to have different elements in an already stressed health system competing for economic resources. The universal pharmacare program that has been proposed by the Liberals and NDP is a terribly, terribly expensive proposition. What will happen to the rest of healthcare? Does that mean that within the Canada Health Transfer, we're just going to load in another pressure that needs to somehow be sorted out? Much better to identify the gaps. There are small gaps, readily identifiable. Let's fill those gaps, make sure that everyone has access to needed medicines. That's an important goal that should come to pass, but we'll focus on the gaps and in that way ensure access to needed medicines without adding additional pressures to an already stretched health system.
Emily Taman, is the NDP plan for universal pharmacare too expensive? Can this country actually afford it?
Absolutely. I mean, this idea that we have to choose between having an under-resourced healthcare system or an under-resourced pharmacare program is just a ridiculously false premise and choice. We have enormous wealth in our country. We can reform our tax system, including by bringing in a wealth tax on individuals worth more than $20 million. And the parliamentary budget officer has agreed that that could raise up to $70 billion over the course of 10 years. I think one of the real problems, again, this is this kind of obsession with only viewing things within the framing of the status quo. To suggest that we shouldn't bring in universal pharmacare because if we have an underfunded healthcare system, let's properly fund our healthcare system at the same time.
Catherine McKenna, would a Liberal government support a universal pharmacare program?
We just announced that we would. We've also changed how we accept drug prices. So we've excluded certain countries, which has significantly reduced the drug costs. We've also announced that everyone should have access to a family doctor, that we will be working certainly very hard on that, and we've made significant investments in mental health. But I sent a letter to Jim Watson asking him recently, I said, I want to know what's happened under Doug Ford. What cuts have we seen? So $6.3 million cut to public health services, $1.2 million cut to long-term care, $1.8 million cut with the elimination of the Addiction Services Initiative program. Because what I'm worried about, what I hear from the Conservative Party, is they don't seem to understand that investing in people and making sure that people have the drugs they need, the supports they need, the access to services, is often from an ideological perspective that they don't believe that people that may have drug addiction issues deserve to be treated like human beings, is saving money. It saves no one money to cut services. It saves no one money to make ideological decisions about access to service. It costs us all a lot more, and the people affected, it's devastating.
Angela Keller-Herzog, is the Green Party plan to bring in universal pharmacare too expensive?
The Green Party also is a progressive party and thinks it's time for a universal pharmacare program. Also of interest is that we actually have something in common with the Conservative Party. Like the Conservative Party, and we have just received from the Parliamentary Budget Office and done our homework, and we have our costed platform.
So how much would it cost?
Today.
So how much would a universal pharmacare plan, your plan, cost?
Okay, the universal pharmacare, I think it's actually the most expensive ticket item in this. And I'm sorry, this just came out today, so it really is, okay, here it is, healthcare, and this is, okay, so for 2021, it would be 26.7 billion. Then it goes up a little bit over time to about 30 billion per year.
So how are you going to pay for that?
Okay. Let me just say, first of all, that we, unlike the Conservatives, think that we can balance the budget, and the way to do it is by looking at this as an income distribution issue. Stock markets are at an all-time high. There is extreme wealth in this society and ever-widening income inequality. So the way we would pay for this is we would tax more of the large corporations. We would tax multinational entities that are doing business in Canada, like Amazon, like Facebook, like Google, who are not paying taxes on their business being done in Canada. That'll be more revenues. And we're also looking at a transaction tax on the financial sector, akin to one which is operating in France. The financial sector is recording record profits in the billions. So there's wealth to be redistributed, and we feel that it's time for pharmacare.
Carol Clement-Hagan, surely you would agree that taxing people who can afford to pay that tax makes sense in order to provide people with the medication they need. Surely that's reasonable.
A famous quote comes to mind, and that's that the NDP does eventually run out of other people's money. So this has to be an evidence-informed discussion. So when you look at healthcare, health is the largest expense in the provincial budget. We are talking about a provincial issue now. Health is a provincial jurisdiction. So health is the biggest expense in the provincial budget. And if you look at the Hoskins report, that's a Liberal report costing out pharmacare, it starts out at $15 billion per year. It increases public plan spending by 65%. That is a large amount of dollars. So assuming that we can find enough wealthy folks to try to tax more in order to somehow compensate for this is unrealistic. The super wealthy are extremely mobile. They take their money elsewhere when faced with those kinds of interventions. We need to look at health spending in a very serious way. Stop blowing up federal debts, because we're paying now something like $27 billion in interest charges. That's unproductive dollars that should be available for things like health care, like filling the gap on gaps in pharmacare. Those are the kinds of discussions that we need to be having at the federal level. Serious economic discussions to figure out how we can fund the public priorities that we have, certainly in terms of health care.
Okay. Emily Tamman.
Thank you. I just want to add two quick things. First of all, with all due respect to Catherine McKenna, nice pivot to Doug Ford, but your party has promised pharmacare countless times since the early 90s. Probably the only thing that's been promised more and not delivered is childcare. And so I really don't think your promise has any credibility whatsoever. But I also want to say on the question of universality, that one of the reasons that this needs to be a universal program, just like our healthcare system, and it's essentially the same justification, is that this is also how we're going to considerably lower the cost of prescription drugs. We pay some of the highest prescription drug costs in the entire world. We're one of the only countries with a universal healthcare system that doesn't have a universal pharmacare program. This policy is enormously, enormously overdue, and I really think it's more a question of we can't afford not to do it. The time, I don't even want to say the time was now. The time was a long time ago, but let's do it. Let's do it now.
Okay. We're going to move on.
Okay.
Very, very quickly. Do you have one quick?
Yeah, just a correction. When we talk about comparisons with other countries that have pharmacare, they're very different systems. Most of them have quite a robust parallel private health system, and they also truly look at pharmacare in some different perspectives. We have when you compare health systems internationally, it's a very difficult thing to do. We need to think of it in the Canadian context. How can we organize it with our provincial jurisdiction in health? The provinces, again, have real concerns about the Liberals' proposed plan of universal pharmacare.
Okay. Catherine McKenna, your Liberal Party once pledged to keep deficits under $10 billion and said its government would balance the books by 2019. It hasn't. The Liberal spring budget included extra spending and projected a deficit of $19.8 billion for 2019-2020. Now, given the current trends, the Finance Department doesn't predict a return to balanced budgets until at least 2040. Is it not the case that this iteration of the Liberal Party just doesn't believe in balancing the books?
I think that I often hear this from conservative politicians about, debt. Our debt to GDP ratio is one of the best of G7 countries. We've created 1 million jobs. We have the lowest unemployment rate in 4 decades, and interest rates are really low. So this is the time that you want to invest in infrastructure. It actually just makes sense. And so that's exactly what we're doing. The chronic underinvestment that we saw, the Federation of Canadian Municipalities, we were the only party in the last election said, yes, we need to make investments in affordable housing. Yes, we need to make investments in public transportation. Yes, we need to make investments in green infrastructure. You may recall the last election, the NDP and the Conservative Party were all about getting spending under control. But look what we've been able to do. Just take Ottawa alone. And remember the Conservative Party, they didn't want to invest in Ottawa because they didn't care about Ottawa. We've invested in whether it's LRT, whether it's investments in the super library that we're investing in, whether it's investments in affordable housing. Finally, the federal government is back in affordable housing. The investments in green infrastructure in the Ottawa River. These are all critically important. That we need to make these investments, and those aren't wasting money. Those are investments in the future. Those are investments in jobs. Those are investments in prosperity. Those are investments in climate change and climate action. And we need to make those investments, and we're doing it in a prudent way. And I'm happy to stand against any other country. Look at the stats, look at our job numbers, look at how we've reduced poverty, and also look at our fiscal record.
Angela Keller-Herzog, do you agree that the Liberals have been fine stewards of the Canadian economy?
I think that there's some of the spending that the Liberals have done that we would support. The trick is not so much to have a categorical attitude of no budget deficit ever. The trick is to spend wisely. So, for example, the child tax benefit that the Liberals brought in, I think that Catherine is right. That has led to a significant reduction in child poverty in this country. So I would very much support the continuation of that. However, an example of unwise spending is the $3.3 billion in fossil fuel subsidies that the government seems to be sinking. As I mentioned before, that's like pouring fuel onto the fire. We need to slow down on fossil fuel extraction. Greta Thunberg has explained it to the world. It's not that hard to understand. And in some ways, everyone is upset with Brazil for burning the Amazon forest or not slowing down those fires. Well, we have carbon sinks here in Canada that we need to steward for the globe. And those are the oil sands in Alberta. We have to take responsibility to keep it in the ground.
Marilee Sevilla? In terms of the Liberals, the way in which the Liberals have managed the economy, are you a supporter?
Well, according to CBC, 46 of Canadians are $200 away from insolvency. So the fact that CBC is reporting people are very close to losing or not having enough savings, it's hard to say that our economy is strong. The cost of living is a very big issue. Affordable housing, what is affordable housing? In Ottawa, you cannot find a 1-bedroom for $1,300. You cross the bridge to Gatineau, you can find an apartment for $650. How does that make sense for people living in Ottawa Centre to pay almost double the price of what Gatineau is paying, or Quebec, sorry.
So how would life under a People's Party of Canada government be different?
Well, with our economy, we are reducing taxes. We're creating 2 brackets. So if you make $15,000 to $100,000, you're 15%. Anything above 100,000, you're 25%. So what this does is it allows Canadians to actually pay their debts off, actually save for their future, pay for their kids' education, as opposed to having to decide, do I buy my medication or do I buy a meal for my family? This is what we're doing. And I look at all these plans and I listen to what we're trying to do here. And I must say, all I can think in my head is, all I see is the taxes going up, taxes upon taxes upon taxes. But what we need to look at responsible spending. The taxes are just going up. Why are we penalizing Canadians, hard-working Canadians, and not allowing them to save for their future? The carbon tax. Why are we taxing carbon when an essential thing for Canadians, especially in Ottawa, how do you heat up when it's minus 40 degrees? You use gas. You're going to be taxed on that, on top of tax. How are we saying that our economy is good? How are we saying we're helping Canadians when CBC and the People's Party haven't been fans, claims 46% of us are near insolvency?
Carol Clemenhagen.
The Liberals often speak of what they refer to as flattering debt to GDP ratios around 30%. And they claim to be lifting kids out of poverty with increases to the Canada Child Benefit. It's a program that Conservatives will always protect. But they conveniently forget that at the same time as they're increasing the Canada Child Benefit, which is a good thing, they conveniently overlook the burden that they're simultaneously loading onto the backs of those same kids with federal debt. I have a 19-year-old grandnephew who's just started university with all the excitement and looking forward of youth and the future. If things continue with the Liberals, he'll be stepping into middle age when they finally balance the federal budget. When the Ontario Chamber of Commerce puts the federal debt into context, adding in the substantial provincial debt, the Chamber finds that the debt to GDP ratio for Ontarians nears 80%. That is not so flattering after all.
Emily Simon.
Well, I think when we look at our economic situation that we're in right now, I would say two things. First of all, we just have to be really careful when we're looking at the data to make sure that we're also understanding what people's lived experiences are. So while it's true that we've seen economic growth, that we've got good job numbers, what is the quality of those jobs? Are people continuing to be very precariously employed? And I think the answer is yes. Ms. McKenna's colleague, Bill Morneau, as finance minister, stood up in the House of Commons and essentially said, young people better get used to a future of precarious work because that's the way things are now. Things don't have to be that way. So that would be the first thing I would say. Secondly, I don't think the problem is one of spending. I think the problem is one of revenue. I used to prosecute tax evasion for my career, and I've seen firsthand the lengths that people will go to get out of paying their fair share. And so there's a number of things that we can do, because some of this is almost by design in the Income Tax Act. So I mentioned the wealth tax. But there are other things, there are other aspects of our tax system that continue to be very regressive. So for example, the preferential treatment of investment income as opposed to employment income. The halving of the corporate tax rate over the last 20 years. Many of these measures were pitched to us on the promise that they would bring certain economic advantages, this kind of neoliberal trickle-down economic stuff that's now been pretty much wholly debunked. And so, in fact, one of the measures that we're proposing, for example, to bring more progressiveness to our tax system again, is to raise the inclusionary rate for capital gains from the current 50% to 75%. It's not that long ago that that's how it was. We get very, entrenched in this idea of how our tax system works, how our economy works. But in reality, a lot of these are relatively new measures, and they've really been shown not to be effective. And so, we're really wanting to look very comprehensively at how we can reform our tax system to make sure that it's a progressive tax system and to ensure that it's generating the revenues we need to have properly funded public services.
Okay. I want to move on to housing. Do you want a quick comment? Yes, Angela? Do you want to add something?
I would like to add, Emily is proposing that we close some loopholes for the rich. We would support that. But we would also like to close off some of the cracks through which some members of our country are falling. We have 9.5 million Canadians living in poverty. The Green Party would propose that we work towards a guaranteed livable income, so that rather than having a patchwork of social programs, some of which are bureaucratic nightmares, that we have one level floor on which everyone can stand. And as we have various structural adjustments in our economy, whether it's caused by artificial intelligence or automation, or indeed shifts away from fossil fuel intensive sectors, We have a transition support for workers, and we also have the assurance that no one is going to be living in poverty, but there's a basic income that we can all rely on as Canadians.
Catherine McKenna, would the Liberal Party support a guaranteed annual income?
Well, I mean, certainly it was really unfortunate to see Doug Ford cut, guaranteed minimum income pilot that was going on in Hamilton. It had huge impacts on people who were counting on it.
So so your government does support the idea?
Well, I think that we need to look creatively at solutions, and that might be one of the solutions. I think we need to look at the evidence on that. But I agree on affordability. Mary Lee and I might not agree on much, but on affordability, of course life has to be affordable. That's why we did something that is really hard. That we raised taxes on the 1%, probably some of you in this room, so we could lower them on the middle class. That we've lowered small business taxes from 11 to 9%. That we've made the investments in housing. We need to continue, but our government stepped up, said $55 billion in housing, because if you can't afford housing, you can't afford the other things. You're probably skimping on your prescription drugs. So that has certainly been our focus, but also on putting a price on pollution, because I think it's really, really important. Putting a price on pollution. We put a price on pollution here in Ontario. There was a price, but unfortunately Doug Ford got rid of it as his first act. We've given the money back through the tax system such that 8 out of 10 families are better off, and the ones that are best off are lower and middle income people. As we move forward to transform our economy, which is what we are working so hard on doing, we do need to figure out the affordability. We do need to worry about people's jobs, because people, they want to take action on climate change, but they also need to worry about paying their bills. That's absolutely what we're focused on. So affordability, making sure that everyone has a chance to succeed, and that we innovate, and that we actually build this economy of the future. And I do want to say one thing, because I don't know if I'll get it. Net zero, why is net zero by 2050 so important, and why what we announced is so important? Because we are also going to legislate so that you have 5-year targets, because right now it is very challenging, because everyone ends up fighting and you can't move forward together. And we have three parties here who actually believe we need ambitious action, but in this election we could lose all of it, because we have parties who are saying things that are simply not true about price on pollution and so many other things we're doing.
We're going to move on to housing. Angela Keller-Herzog, your Green Party has stated in its platform that it wants to legislate housing as a legally protected fundamental human right for all Canadians. And yet your plan to build affordable housing is far less ambitious than either the New Democrats or Liberals. Whereas they are proposing to build tens of thousands of affordable units over the next decade, you're proposing to build 25,000 and renovate 15,000. Why are your goals for affordable housing in Canada so modest?
Okay, I think that the housing sector can be sliced and diced in different ways. It seems to me that the national housing strategy that I think it started in 2016 or 17 and is now in its first few years. It's been not very effective at all in terms of providing new especially rental housing units. Ottawa has not seen hardly any of the benefits of this federal plan, and as I think everyone in this room knows, it's not just Toronto and Vancouver that have an affordable housing shortage, but we do as well. And I think that that's something that Marilee and I agree on. So I think that if you look at the Green election platform, you'll discover significant support for rental housing and for co-op housing and for also nonprofit structures. We think that the mandate of the Canadian Housing and Mortgage Corporation should not be to de-risk private and first-time private home ownership, but there should be a shift in focusing on affordable housing and the creation of new rental housing units.
Carol Clement-Higgin, what's the Conservative Party's plan to deal with the affordable housing crisis that so many Canadians from coast to coast to coast find themselves in?
I think it bears mentioning. When you look at Ottawa housing, the Ottawa housing budget 2018, the city covers about 53% of it, province 33%. The federal contribution comes up to about 13%. So again, we're talking very much about a local issue. Oftentimes a municipal lead is required in the housing sector.
But the federal government can provide leadership.
Yeah, well, there's 13%. Certainly, the federal government's contribution goes to be of assistance. So the question becomes, is housing being built at the rate required to meet need? I mean, are we producing units? And there are barriers to construction. The private sector is often the group that is actually building the units. Again, back to municipalities. Are we helping? Are we facilitating the construction of units in a timely manner? When you look at the numbers, the city has a target of 25% new rental units as affordable. There's a pace of construction that is a reality. So we're trying to facilitate the process. The Conservative plan deals with increasing the ability of first-time homeowners, making the mortgage stress test a little more sensible, increasing amortization periods, making federal lands that are surplus available for development, again, to facilitate construction.
Emily Chapman?
Well, there's no question. I mean, affordable housing is one of the top issues that's coming up in Ottawa Centre next to climate change. And like climate change, I would suggest that the Liberals are quite effective at naming and framing the scale of the crisis. They refer to it as a crisis. But in terms of the solutions that are being brought forward, for example, you declare housing a human right, you say we have a housing crisis, and then you put in place a strategy that doesn't even roll out the money for several years. So, and when I hear this $55 billion number, I mean, that is a number that has been widely debunked. It relies on provincial contributions that haven't even been ascertained. And it re-announces money, which is, something that Ms. McKenna did in the course of this campaign, stand up next to her friend Jim Watson to re-announce a project that's already essentially been built. New Democrats are committed to building 500,000 units across Canada of affordable housing. We want to invest in nonprofit housing, in cooperative housing. We want to make sure that everybody has access to an affordable rental place. I mean, in Ottawa right now, it's absolutely out of control. I've seen people struggling. I met someone who was renting a balcony to sleep on in a G7 capital. It's completely unacceptable. In the short term, because Carol's right, it takes time to build these units. So two things. Number one, the federal government could be acquiring units. We have empty buildings in our city that are being underutilized and could be converted into housing much more quickly. And we would bring forward a rental subsidy program in the short term to ensure that while people wait for new housing to be built, that they can get some relief so that no one's putting more than 30% of their income towards their housing.
Okay. Catherine McKenna?
Once again, in the last election, we were the only party who said that we were committed to making significant investments. So we also are back in housing. The federal government was absent for decades. We have a national housing strategy. Right here in Ottawa Centre, we've invested already $220 million. That is 1,600 people that are being helped right now, and that's just on new builds. That doesn't include the rent supplements that we've included. And yes, that is King's Sons and Daughters. That is a new build. That's CCOC in Arlington. That was we just had the opening. Had a chance to meet with Fadumo, who is this amazing woman who's so excited because her daughters and she will have a place to live. It's also to the passive standards. So we're making sure that we invest in most energy efficient standards, because the people who can afford it the least should pay the least when it comes to energy costs. Cornerstone housing for women, 9 different housing projects, Rochester Heights. Do we have more to do? Absolutely. But let's be clear, nothing was going on for the past decades. The federal government was missing in action, and we're going to continue rolling out these investments. I also think we have made a commitment to federal, looking at federal land and providing it for housing, and that's something that you can listen to. I'm going to be making another local announcement because I believe it is critically important that we do even more when it comes to affordable housing right here for everyone in Ottawa Centre.
Okay, Marilee Salina.
Well, it's kind of nice to have a few people up here agree with something I said this entire night. And, I think about housing, and it is the basic need. It's one of the most basic needs, and we do have to address it. And I think about LeBreton Flats right now. That is federal property, hasn't been touched. And that is something, if I were elected, that I would take and I would find sponsors, I'd find builders and say, let's create affordable housing here. Because people who need affordable housing, they shouldn't have to live just somewhere far away. They should be able to also experience the city, enjoy being close to the Ottawa River. And LeBreton Flats has been untouched. And all of a sudden, we hear in the headlines that there's going to be, plans, the current government, not naming names because I don't think it's right to name names. But I want to tackle that because we cannot just wait every 4 years for something to happen. We can't just wait when one goal has been achieved. We have to wait for the next election for something major to happen. I say affordable housing, lowering taxes, that is what we stand for.
Final words to Angela Keller-Herzog.
I'd like to comment on the LeBreton Flats situation as well. I think that the Liberals and Conservatives, our old parties, would both take an approach which they would call a monetization of federal lands. And to me, that is just another word for privatization. So what they're doing is they're taking public lands and giving it over to private interests and getting very little back in return. All at the same time saying that we have an affordable housing crisis. So what I would propose, and perhaps what Marilee and Emily would agree, is that we should put some of that land into a public trust and then have long-term benefits for the public by having affordable housing through co-op or non-profit co-op housing to be created there.
Okay. Carol Clemenhagen, the opioid crisis has been wreaking havoc across Canada, including here in Ottawa. According to Stats Can, since 2016, there have been more than 9,000 apparent opioid-related deaths. In 2017, approximately 11 lives were lost every single day because of overdoses. In 2001, Portugal decriminalized all illicit drugs. And since that time, there's been a dramatic decline in overdoses, HIV infection, and drug-related crime in that country. How would a Conservative government approach the crisis, and would the decriminalization of illicit drugs in Canada be part of your plan?
One of the real gaps often with dealing with addiction is actual follow-up in service to people who are trying to cope with addictions. So, goes back to my earlier comments on the need to ensure that we're able to invest in the health system, to increase services and support where needed, where new and emerging problems develop. And addiction services and mental health services have often been areas where there have been gaps in funding. Again, we're in a situation where we at the provincial level, certainly in Ontario, given the debt situation that the Liberal government, 15 years of Liberal debts racked up in Ontario, we tend to forget these things, but Moody's credit agency actually downgraded the credit rating for the province of Ontario, the largest and most prosperous province in the country. So we can certainly be concerned about issues of how we go about getting back on track in terms of getting to a balanced budget.
But would you decriminalize illicit drugs?
I think the real issue is to help people who are suffering from addiction.
So that's
help them. I think the focus needs to be on
but you're not really answering the question. So the answer is yes or no?
I think the issue is the person. The person is the issue. How do we help the person get to a stage where they're not perhaps that they're not suffering from an addiction? Okay. That would be my focus.
Catherine McKenna, we see the example of Portugal. Should Canada decriminalize illicit drugs, and would a Liberal government support that kind of plan?
Well, the first thing we shouldn't do is criticize and cut funding to safe injection sites. I saw that Andrew Scheer said our policy was a colossal failure. He doesn't think that people should have access to the critical services and
That's not true.
science-based
That's
policy.
simply not
But
true.
it is what he said.
That's simply not true.
It is what he has said.
That is simply
and
not true.
Doug Ford has
Let's
also...
stick to the facts. Let's stick to
I'm
the
happy
facts.
that is
Okay,
a fact.
okay.
That is a fact. But I would also say, like, look what happened here with Doug Ford. He cut $1.8 million to Addiction Services Initiative programs.
That's
helping-
not true either.
Ms. McKenna, you haven't answered the question
But-
either.
but
The
so-
the question was,
so-
the question was, would a Liberal government support the decriminalization of illicit drugs?
So we've
Yes or no?
We've legalized marijuana. I mean, I think we need to look at what initiatives work and make sense based on evidence. But you did talk about the opioid crisis, and that's a huge issue in our community. We know that. But we do need to be providing the critical services for folks. And we can't be stigmatizing folks because they have addictions. And that is what's happening. That's happening under Doug Ford. Andrew Scheer is taking the same ideological approach. So, yes, I mean, maybe we need to look at other initiatives. But I think, first of all, we need to do what we know works, which is provide the services rather than cut the urgent services that folks need.
Health is a provincial matter.
Emily
The province
Tamman?
is investing in
Carol, we're
those
going to move on
services.
to Emily Tamman, the NDP's approach.
Yes. Actually, we need to do a lot more than decriminalize. Again, I used to be a federal Crown prosecutor. I was one of a small number in my office who prosecuted corporate crime, but unfortunately most of my colleagues were engaged in the prosecution of drug offenses. And I've seen the harms that criminalization caused. The criminalization of opioids and other drugs is contributing to the public health crisis that we're seeing today, that is the opioid crisis. So I would actually take it one step further. In addition to decriminalizing, we have to start looking at safe supply. It's the only way that we're going to prevent these deaths. I know it's uncomfortable for a lot of people, but if we're going to treat this as the health crisis that it is, that's an absolutely necessary step. Let me just say, if it was babies dying at the rate that we're seeing people die from opioid overdoses, we would be doing much more than we are. We have to do what the evidence shows. Harm reduction, supervised consumption is an important interim measure. It is not getting us, it's not fixing the problem, so we need to maintain that, but we have to decriminalize and we have to move to safe supply.
Angela Keller-Herzog.
The answer is yes. The Green Party of Canada is fully behind decriminalization. We see it as a health issue, a mental health issue also related. We see it as a poverty issue. We don't see it as a criminal issue.
Marilee Sevilla.
No. You can't. Decriminalizing it, we saw the legalization of marijuana and how that helped. There's no money made from that, and our government thought we were going to profit a lot of money, and we didn't, unfortunately. We had one opportunity to make money off that. And decriminalizing illicit drugs, I don't think that is going to help anybody. I think, like my colleagues here to the left, we have to find the programs. We have to address it, not just say, yeah, free for all for
So
everybody.
you're not persuaded by Portugal's example?
No. I think there still needs to be more research and more work done.
But they've been researching it for 18 years.
18 years, I'm sure we could go for another 2, make it 20.
Okay. I have one quick question, and it's this. Opponents of Quebec's new secularism law are planning a rally in Montreal on Saturday to protest Bill 21, a law that prevents new teachers and other public officials from wearing religious symbols while at work. Many of Canada's most prominent constitutional law scholars say the bill contravenes Canada's Charter of Rights and Freedoms. Emily Tamman, you're a lawyer and law professor. Your leader, Jagmeet Singh, went on a popular Quebec TV show on the weekend and said he wouldn't challenge Bill 21. Isn't this a betrayal of the very values Mr. Singh purports to hold? Wouldn't a principled federal leader fight tooth and nail for the individual rights of Canadians, regardless of the political cost?
Well, I mean, it is really devastating, and I think it's not just constitutional scholars. I mean, I think all lawyers understand that Bill 21 contravenes the Charter, and the Quebec government itself acknowledges that, invoking the notwithstanding clause.
But it's nice to say it. Shouldn't your leader be fighting for it?
So, I mean, this is certainly something I would fight for, but what I want to say about what Jagmeet Singh has said about this is that There's no question that this litigation is going all the way to the Supreme Court of Canada, and I hope that we can find a basis to negate the invocation of the notwithstanding clause. At the trial level, where the evidence is going to be called and where the facts are going to be gathered, that is going to be for the parties that are taking this case forward. But I do sincerely hope, and Jagmeet Singh has said that he's very much open to intervening in the case at the appellate level. And I think that would be a perfectly appropriate role for the federal government to take. I think it would actually be quite unusual for the federal government not to intervene at the appellate level in a case like this, but it actually would be relatively unusual for the federal government to intervene at the trial level.
Catherine McKenna, would a Liberal government intervene?
We have said that we would consider intervening. I mean, look, it is terrible.
You're a lawyer too. Should the Liberal government
Don't
not
hold
intervene?
it against me. Don't hold it against
But
me.
should the Liberal government not intervene? Should it not?
I mean, I think we're watching this very closely. Look, this is terrible. I think about I think about my colleagues. It means that if you take Harjit Sajjan, who's our Minister of National Defense, that he wouldn't be able to be a cop like he was. That you would have folks that can't be teachers. This is unacceptable, that people should be able to wear whatever they want. And this is something that is a huge challenge. I mean, the idea that you would use your notwithstanding clause, I mean, it's quite devastating because, I mean, that is against everything I certainly stand for. And I think that we have certainly not closed the door. I thought that the leader of the NDP had. Maybe I misunderstood him on Tout le monde en parle, but I think this is something that we do need to stand up for, people's right to wear what they want.
Carol Clement-Higgin, what's the Conservative Party's position on this? Would a Conservative government intervene?
I think we need to recognize the federation and the division of powers between federal and provincial levels of government. This is a bill at the provincial level that went through the provincial assembly and was passed with considerable support. The Conservatives have made clear that we would certainly not entertain similar concepts at the national level, but that we would respect the decision of the Quebec Parliament.
Angela Keller-Herzog.
In the Green Party, our framework is that individual Green Party delegates are not whipped by the party. And that means that as the delegate, as the member representing Ottawa Centre, I would be able to respond to what my constituents felt was right. I personally feel that we have to stand up against racism when we see it in this most blatant form. And I think that many people in this room would strongly agree with me. So I think that if I were to be the Member of Parliament for Ottawa Centre, I would do my utmost to seek legal advice, because I'm an economist, not a lawyer, on what are the ways that the federal government could intervene in this instance. I think that the Constitution has not only the notwithstanding clause, but also provisions for peace, order, and good government, where the federal government has an obligation to do the right thing. And I think standing up to racism in such a blatant form is one of the obligations that we would look to the federal government of Canada to uphold.
Marilee Sevilla.
This is a tough one because, as mentioned, this was a provincial bill that was passed. So federally, we have to respect that province's decision. However, kind of what you were saying about individual and fighting against racism, I would, because at the same time you have to say, are they doing any harm with what they are wearing? Is it hurting anybody? But I think we have to respect the Quebec's government and their decision and allow them to manage it. It's not a federal issue, but if need be.
Okay, I'm going to ask a question. We only have about 15 minutes, oh, actually about 10 minutes to go, and I wanted to ask a couple of questions from the floor. So this is for Catherine McKenna. What will your government do to give permanent resident status and open the path to citizenship to the thousands of non-status people who live in this country? So many of us live on the margins, always fearful of deportation, losing our loved ones, and without proper access to work. The system has failed us. What will your government do?
We've certainly been working extremely hard through our immigration system. As I say, we came in, we had massive backlogs, that there were family reunification was a complete disaster. We weren't accepting refugees, we weren't providing health care to refugees, and we've worked really hard on that. And it's certainly my local office, I will say we work, this is the bread and butter of what we do, trying to support folks that want to have a path to citizenship, that, you know, for whatever reason that the system isn't working for them. You know, there is a process that you do have to go through, and I think that is incredibly important, but we have to make sure that the resources are there and that there is a proper path through our system. As Emily said, our system works pretty well, but there's been huge underinvestment, and it is under stress because we are having pressures from our southern border because unfortunately the situation is there such that people want to leave the United States and they want to come up to Canada. But we're a party that has always believed that we are better with immigration. And one thing I do worry about, and is an honest question for other parties, is when people say it's about your individual beliefs but not your party belief. What does your party stand for? Like in the Green Party, they have a separatist. Like, can anyone have any belief? And I'm not saying this about you, Angela. I believe strongly in Angela. But what about, you know, if someone in your party didn't support your climate change plan? Can everyone just decide what they're going to do? Because it's not about being whipped. It's actually about standing up for beliefs. It's about standing up national interests. It's about standing up for our Constitution. And I do worry when I hear parties that aspire to be running the country when they say that anyone can have a view within the party. It's about the individual. Parties
I guess
have to
Jane
stand for
Philpott
something.
and Jody Wilson-Raybould would agree with that.
I would say, Ms. McKenna, that some people might take issue with the Liberal government's approach to Saudi Arabia and the selling of arms, and that doesn't necessarily seem to be in line with the values of the Liberal Party, or is it?
Well, I think that is a really big issue. We've certainly seen how Saudi Arabia has acted. My background is as a human rights lawyer. I think it is a huge challenge. And I think that we need to be looking very closely, including at the contract that was signed under the previous government. We have been doing that, and we have to look at, you know, the human rights behavior that we've seen of many countries. That is a significant concern to me, that the human rights abuses that are going on around the world that are increasing. You know, that is something that I personally believe in, but I think our party strongly believes in standing up for human rights, and you've seen Chrystia Freeland do that in so many different instances and cases.
Emily Taman, explain your position on the boycott, divest, and sanction Israel movement. Is your position in line with your party's position about this, the BDS movement?
Yes, thank you. You are asking my personal view?
Personal, and whether it's in line with your party's position.
So I don't support BDS as a question of national policy. I don't think it would be effective in the current global climate for a country like Canada to adopt a policy of BDS. Having said that, I fully respect the rights of individual Canadians to take whatever measure they feel appropriate, particularly in the context of human rights advocacy. And I think it's very, very concerning, the efforts to quash any kind of public debate on the issue, to label all proponents of BDS as anti-Semitic. I think it's important on all of these issues that we are enabled to have a robust public policy debate in terms of how to best address the question of human rights for the people in Palestine.
Carol Clemenhagen, this is from the floor. Quote, I care about Canada's role in ending global poverty. At the moment, we're far behind other wealthy countries in this fight. What would your government do to get Canada on track to where, I think it says, we should be?
Okay, so certainly the issue of cost of living is something that is of great concern to all of us in the room. The Conservative Party is very much focused on putting money in people's pockets with universal tax credit, HST off home heating, green public tax transit.
The question was a foreign policy, but global. It was about global poverty.
Global poverty.
Yes.
I'm sorry, I missed that that part. Okay. Well, global policy, we're talking about development aid.
Sure.
Canada has, for some years, unfortunately, not been able to increase its proportion of development aid. We're not at the 0.7% GDP contribution that we would like to, that Lester Pearson famously put into place, and which has become a goal for a number of countries. Under the Liberals, strangely enough, that the amount of overseas development aid has stayed pretty much stuck where it was at for some years. When the Conservative government takes place, the competent and caring Conservative government that I know will come to work for all of us, we're going to be focused very much on economic development, building Canada's strong economy, and being careful and responsible about balancing the budget in order to be able to invest in priorities, certainly at home, healthcare, climate action, infrastructure, and also to be able to live up to our responsibility as a member of the global community in the tradition of Canada as a middle power that has often played the role of honest broker, and body and country really that can reach out, help other nations, and address health inequalities in the broadest sense in the global context.
Okay. We're rapidly running out of time, and I just like